Right, just a few words about threads. Fairly boring topic, but we all use them every day of the week. You probably used a thread this morning to screw the cap on your toothpaste tube. If you had a bit of bad luck and had a puncture, you'd be using your screw jack to raise the car up. And yet we use threads but know little about them. Even mechanics often don't understand a bit about screw threads, the important stuff. So a screw thread's been around with us for years. Even Archimedes, who you heard about from school days, did a screw thread. He used it, would you believe, to raise water as a pump. Since then, things have moved on, and screw threads now are used every day by industry to screw bits and pieces together. A screw thread, as you probably realise, is nothing more than a groove cut into the outside of a bolt, and a groove is a very useful tool to transmit movement, hence the jacks that you use to jack your car up. Also, we use bolts and nuts to clamp things together. Now, you need to understand the mechanics a little bit about a thread, and a thread really is nothing more than, here's a bit of a tube. I've drawn a line round here to show a thread impression, a groove cut into a tube. Some threads are very coarse, in other words, they've got a very steep spiral, and some threads are very fine with a close spiral, and we measure the threads number of points in an inch with imperial measurement. If you could unwind that thread, something I prepared earlier, if you unwind that thread, you'll see you end up with nothing more than a wedge shape. So a screw thread is nothing more than an inclined plane wrapped around a tube. If I look at that particular item there, it's a gentle wedge. This one here, where it's a well-spaced coarse thread with very few turns in an inch, you can unwind it and see it's a wedge, but it's a very thick wedge. If you were about to wedge the shed door, to have it blown around in the wind, and you wanted to stop it blowing, would you use one like that, or would you use one like that? Which would give you the best locking power? Clearly you go for the slow wedge, because that would give you more locking power to stop the door swinging in the wind. Now that is commonly true of a thread on a car. If you want a thread that's got loads of locking power, you choose a fine thread like that. If you wanted a strong thread where locking power wasn't so important, you'd have a coarse thread. So there's different sorts of threads for different applications. If you want loads of strength, you'll go for a coarse thread, because with a coarse thread you can have a deeper groove. Whereas if you have a very fine thread, the groove is very shallow, it's not very strong. So any thread is a compromise between power or locking. Now, in the old days, even before I was born, Industrial Revolution period, for example, every company had their own thread design. And that was fine for that company, but bits weren't interchangeable. And so a guy came along, more famous than Archimedes, who's long since buried, a guy called Joseph Whitworth. And Whitworth was a bit of an engineer, entrepreneur, and he recognised the need to standardise threads. So every manufacturer had the same thread form, and then components were interchangeable. So Whitworth came along back in Industrial Revolution time and said, we need to standardise our thread forms. Whitworth is a name that you need to remember. In fact, you see it on every spanner that you use on old cars, because they stamped up W for Whitworth, his name. And he introduced, well, first of all, he suggested a standard, which he called the British Standard Whitworth Thread, BSW for short, British Standard Whitworth, BSW. And he introduced a thread that was a fairly coarse thread, lots of strength, but not a great deal of locking power. And he quickly realised that you needed some other standard for a finer thread. And so he introduced alongside another standard, this time British Standard Fine, BSW, British Standard Whitworth Fine, abbreviated now to BSF. So BSF, BSW, these are the spanners that we use on our old cars, certainly on the old Austins. Any cars from the 1930s would be an imperial thread, imperial, because Whitworth was born in the imperial days when Britain was a nation to be contended with the imperial Raj and all the rest of it. So we take the British standard width, which is an imperial thread measured in inches, fractions of an inch, 16th of an inch, because in those days that was our standard measurement before the days of metrication and so on. So British standard Whitworth is an imperial thread introduced by Whitworth, and it was the norm for many, many years, certainly during the time when our vehicles were manufactured. The problem is that, as I said earlier, fine threads give you a superb locking power, and Whitworth introduced a fine thread alongside a coarse thread. But those who had specialist needs, people who produced bicycles, for example, with hard solid tyres in those days, they had to handle driving over the cobbles, vibrating over the bumps. And that, of course, introduced a need for a thread that was even finer than the British standard fine thread that Whitworth introduced. So the cycle industry, being awkward, they said we want our own standard thread. So they introduced a British cycle thread, BSW, which surprisingly is very fine, but it's 26 threads to the inch. And whatever diameter the thread is, whatever the outside diameter of a thread might be, big or small, if it's a bicycle thread, it'll be 26 threads to the inch. So that's a bit of a buggeration factor, really, because it means that you've got all sorts of problems with Whitworth standard, coarse, Whitworth fine. Then you get cycle threads, special thread for bicycles and motorcycles. Then, of course, there are other specialist needs like gas and pipe threads. Gas industry pipes, they wanted pipe threads that would go over the outside diameter of a pipe. And said, well, hang on, we've got a special need as well. We want to have a pipe thread. So already the complexity of threads that were available was immense. And that's why people have problems with threads when they're working on old cars. It's bad enough with just those sort of 4 variations: Whitworth fine, Whitworth coarse, pipe threads, and cycle threads. So you've got variation of 4 there, and of course every different diameter thread had a different pitch, number of turns in an inch. But we managed okay with those 4 threads. But of course, when the Second World War started, and we were being aided by the good old Yanks, who've now recently been helping those in the you know where, until Trump came along. We were okay with our own threads, but when the war came along, we were having lots of help from the Americans, and they had, would you believe, their own thread called the American National Thread, ANF, American National. Their standards were different because they obviously hadn't been influenced by years ago by Joseph Whitworth. So that when we had the war help and the Americans were supplying equipment, their threads didn't match with our old Whitworth and BSF threads. So we had another buggeration factor. We had the UNF, Unified National Fine, or American threads as they were called. Slightly different to the Whitworth threads because they got a different V form. The V form on a Whitworth thread is 55 degrees. That's the angle of the thread that's cut around the bolt. The American had a 60-degree thread. Only a marginal difference, but enough to be troublesome sometimes. The difference between a thread you screw down with your fingers or one that wanted the spanner. We lived with that for a while, but when, after the war, NATO became a prominent feature in the defence of the Western world, we had a lot of American equipment in the UK, which demanded us to introduce American national threads as a sort of standard, a subsidiary standard to the British Whitworth threads. And even now, when you open your tool set, the chances are amongst your spanners, you'll find some that say across flats AF, measurement of the hexagon on the head of the bolt. And on some spanners, you'll see W, Whitworth. Very close, very similar, but you try and use a Whitworth spanner on a UNF nut, and you'll round the edges off the nut. So again, you need to be aware of the different spanners to suit the different threads. Whitworth threads are marked up with the size of the thread that the hexagon will unscrew. A quarter Whitworth, for example, it doesn't mean the jaws on the spanner are a quarter of an inch apart. It means the thread which that would unscrew is a quarter of an inch thread. Whereas AF spanners will be marked up AF, and it'll give you a size, 7/16 or ½ inch AF. That is the size of the jaws of hexagon that forms the hexagon on that particular thread. So that's again a bit of a pain in the butt. And they also, of course, had a different pitch, different threads to the inch. So mixing the two together is a recipe for disaster. It's why you find people ending up with bleeding knuckles, because they've tried to force the wrong thread into the wrong nut, end up struggling, rounding the nuts, bruise the knuckles, and end up using very rude swear words. So we've survived all of that. Yet even another instance that causes confusion is when we went metric, not many years back by my standard, but a long time ago for the youngsters in the organisation. When we had metrication come along and we moved from imperial to metric threads, then we introduced obviously a whole different confusion. So you're likely to meet on a car that's got parts that have been recently produced by well-intended manufacturers who aren't familiar with the old Whitworth and BFF threads. You can end up with a car component part that's been made but with a metric thread. So the danger is when you get replacement components that aren't kosher, you can end up trying to force the wrong items together and cause all sorts of problems. So the whole thing is a bit complex, but it's a thing that you need to understand in order to get a grip of the basics, so you don't end up trying to force the wrong thread into the wrong nut and end up with sorts of problems and causing future problems for those who inherit our cars when we've clocked off. Okay, hope it's been useful.